Tell me, have you ever felt that some old books seem to speak directly to something that sleeps inside the soul? As if they carry memories that you never experienced, but that you somehow recognize? If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is exactly what you needed to hear. There are texts that were written to inform, others to guide, but there are those that seem to carry a whisper, as if someone, far beyond our time, had left clues for moments of awakening. And, among all the ancient manuscripts, none provokes as much mystery as the Book of Enoch, a book that talks about men who talked to angels, and angels who descended to earth as if crossing a portal between dimensions. But why was such an ancient, powerful text removed from the Bible? And why did civilizations so far apart, Hebrews, Ethiopians, Gnostics, Essenes, preserve parts of the same story, as if they knew that one day we would look up to the sky again with questions we had never asked before? Imagine Enoch, an ordinary man walking through the night, the wind passing through the trees, the silence of the desert, and then the light. Not an ordinary light, but something that does not belong to the world we know. The book states that the Watchers descended, who taught humans knowledge that should only exist in higher realms. Enoch writes as if trying to record the impossible. Celestial cities, journeys above the clouds, beings that shine like live coals, technology that should not have existed at that time. Could this be just a spiritual metaphor, or records of something that today we would call interdimensional contact? The curious thing is that when we read this text with the eyes of modern science, quantum physics, additional dimensions, light portals, subtle matter, everything starts to make a strange sense, as if what we called myth was, in fact, encoding phenomena that we are only now beginning to understand. And perhaps that is why the Book of Enoch is so disturbing. He not only questions the nature of angels, he questions our own origins. He suggests that we were never alone, and that certain visits were not accidental. So, before we continue, I invite you to stay here with me. If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may lie here, or perhaps where the word meets the mystery. Because the real question is the Book of Enoch just a sacred text, or a detailed record of an encounter between worlds? When we look at the origin of the Book of Enoch, we realize that its story carries something that goes beyond the simple religious narrative. It appears in the intertestamental period, when prophetic silence seemed to fill the earth with an unsettling expectation. Enoch was not just a distant ancestor. He was seen as someone who walked so deeply into mystery that he was taken by the heavens before experiencing death. The text claims to reveal what he saw up there, and why it became dangerous for many. Knowing these visions meant opening windows that perhaps not everyone was ready to face in that time, so vulnerable to the unknown and the sacred in transformation. The first revelation of the Book of Enoch comes when we understand why it was not incorporated into the Western biblical canon. Although preserved in Ethiopia, in fragmentary Hebrew among the Essenes, and cited by ancient authors, many religious leaders feared its symbolic force. He described not just angels, but beings capable of traversing celestial layers, bringing forbidden knowledge to humanity. This narrative seemed too bold, as if someone had recorded a conversation between worlds. The problem was not its spiritual message, but the impact it would have on the traditional understanding of the relationship between heaven and earth, at a time when any conceptual rupture threatened structures already deeply rooted in faith. When exploring this first layer, we realize that the book describes a spiritual world that moves like invisible gears. The Watchers observe, guide, descend, and interact with humans in such a direct way that, for some scholars, the narrative comes close to a report of rapprochement between dimensions. Enoch doesn't just talk about celestial lights. It talks about laws, cycles, territories, and hierarchies. He describes structures that resemble energetic maps, almost as if he were in front of a living architecture. And this makes many wonder if he witnessed something beyond what the language of the time could translate, in a way so surprising that it echoes even in contemporary spiritual discussions today. When we understand the strength of this content, we understand why religious leaders decided to remove it from official discourse. He brought questions that destabilize certainties. If Enoch really had access to higher realities, why did his reports describe movements, sounds, lights, and such specific instructions? Why so many technical details for a spiritual text? This leads many researchers to suggest that perhaps he witnessed something close to what we now call subtle technology or interdimensional manifestation, not a machine, but a presence that reorganizes space, vibration, and consciousness, inviting the reader to realize that the invisible also has structure in each layer that silently reveals itself before him there now. But perhaps the most impactful point of this initial revelation is realizing how the text describes humanity at that time. For Enoch, men still walked between the sacred and the instinctive, vulnerable to the interference of forces they did not understand. The Watchers appear as liminal figures, torn between fulfilling a celestial purpose and giving in to the fascination with matter. This tension echoes not only in the spiritual tradition, but in depth psychology, the conflict between the higher calling and the desire that drags. The book suggests that their downfall began when they looked at us with a kind of fascination that went beyond their original mission and opened doors they never should have. And here the doubt arises that takes us to the next step of this spiritual investigation. If the book describes beings who taught metals, roots, enchantments, cosmology, and forbidden arts, what exactly did Enoch witness? The text does not treat these teachings as metaphors, but as direct interferences in human development. It's as if someone had opened a pedagogical portal between realms. This forces us to ask, are we facing angels, messengers, or visitors from a more subtle layer of existence? This doubt is the seed that grows in every attentive reader, and perhaps that is precisely where the mystery begins to reveal itself more and more. When we advance to the second great revelation of the Book of Enoch, we enter the territory where spirituality, ancient symbolism, and phenomena that today we would call interdimensional begin to intertwine. It is here that the Watchers appear, beings described as celestial, observers designed to monitor humanity from a distance, guarding invisible balances. But suddenly something unexpected happens. They go down. They cross a border. They enter the human plane like someone crossing a membrane between worlds. For Enoch, this moment was not just a spiritual event. It was a rupture that would change everything we knew about the origins of human knowledge. The book describes these beings with characteristics that go beyond common language. Their bodies glowed like fire, their voices were like thunder, and their presence made nature bow. For many modern scholars, this description recalls not only spiritual entities, but manifestations of beings that vibrate at frequencies different from dense matter, almost like travelers between dimensions. The light that surrounded them was not just symbolic. It seemed to have texture, movement, intention. Enoch narrates that when he looked at them, he felt like he was facing something that mixed terror and revelation, as if his soul recognized something that the mind could not yet fully understand there. The most intriguing point is that the Watchers didn't just come to observe, they taught. They offered knowledge about metals, cosmology, medicinal roots, weapons, writing, enchantments, and beauty. Each of them specialized in a specific domain, as if they were emissaries of some structured order, bringing knowledge that, according to the text, was forbidden for the stage in which humanity found itself. This list makes many researchers question whether what Enoch witnessed could have been a transfer of technology, not mechanical technology, but advanced knowledge, impossible to exist in his time without external intervention that revealed itself. The strangest thing is the precision with which the book describes this transmission of knowledge. He does not speak of vague divine inspiration. It talks about instructions, processes, secrets revealed without humanity being prepared. It is as if someone had opened a sacred archive ahead of time, bringing to men what the angels should keep for future cycles. This detail makes the narrative become uncomfortably concrete. There is too much information, too specific, to be seen as simple metaphors. But the text also reveals the price of this rupture. The Watchers, when enchanted by the beauty of men's daughters, make decisions that take them away from their original mission. There is a deep psychological parallel here. Even elevated beings can become lost when they forget who they are. Jung would call this a fall into the shadow, when the sacred mixes with desire and loses its balance. But Enoch goes beyond psychology. For him, this undue approach opened energetic gaps that altered the course of humanity. The birth of the giants, the Nephilim, symbolizes not only a hybrid race, but the result of forces that are and mixed out of time for their own cycle there. This narrative, when read through contemporary eyes, raises bold questions. Was Enoch describing spiritual beings, interdimensional beings, or memories of contacts so old that they have become myth? The Watchers descend not as shadows, but as luminous presences that break the boundary between heaven and earth. Their impact is so great that the book presents them as responsible for imbalances that would lead to the great reset of humanity, the flood. If these beings brought forbidden knowledge, and if their fall triggered such profound consequences, what kind of spiritual or interdimensional technology did they actually present to humanity? And why did it need to be stopped so abruptly? As we enter the third great revelation of the Book of Enoch, we realize that the text does not just describe luminous beings descending from the sky. It details how these beings transmitted knowledge that forever changed the course of humanity. And this is where a point that intrigues spiritualists, researchers, and even modern physicists arises. The description of technologies, arts, and sciences attributed to the Watchers seems to go beyond human capacity at that time. Enoch does not just comment on wisdom, he speaks of advanced metallurgy, precise cosmology, manipulation of roots, adornments that changed perception, and even practices that today would be compared to symbolic genetics. All this with a naturalness that should not have existed in his time and his own world. The first Watcher mentioned, Azazel, is described as being responsible for teaching men the art of working heavy metals, such as bronze and iron, in addition to revealing secrets about weapons, swords, shields, and defense mechanisms. For many scholars of the text, this goes far beyond spiritual metaphors. It chronicles casting, cutting, and construction processes that align with techniques developed only millennia later. This makes some researchers question whether Enoch was recording something he witnessed directly, or whether he was translating, with ancient language, technologies that vibrated in another spectrum of reality, almost like energetic tools materialized in the density of the earthly plane. Another Watcher, named Semjaza, is said to have taught incantations, occult languages, and communication structures that seem more like a symbolic transmission system than simple spiritual practices. Some of these descriptions resemble vibrational patterns, codes that move like waves, almost as if Enoch was trying to explain, in limited words, phenomena similar to frequencies, waves, and subtle fields. This opens the door to surprising interpretations. What if the knowledge delivered to humanity had been a kind of consciousness technology, not something mechanical, but a way of accessing dimensions through one's own being? There are also Watchers who teach astronomy with disconcerting precision. The text mentions constellations, celestial movements, times, seasons, and cardinal points, with an accuracy that does not match human knowledge of that period. This makes many scholars ask, did Enoch receive information about the workings of the cosmos from a source that understood universal laws long before modern science? Or was he describing, with his metaphors, star maps that he saw in celestial visions, as if he were facing something similar to interdimensional projections? Even more intriguing is the teaching of roots and plants. The book states that some Watchers taught women and men how to use herbs for healing, but also for manipulating emotional states and sensory perceptions. This comes close to what we now call psychopharmacology, the use of natural substances to alter consciousness, heal trauma, and open inner portals. It is as if Enoch was describing advanced botanical knowledge, which involved chemistry, medicine, and spirituality at the same time, something far beyond what would be expected from antiquity. The combination of all these teachings forms a surprising image. The Watchers did not just come as messenger angels. They came as instructors, bearers of specific knowledge, as specialists from different areas, each responsible for a function. This hierarchical structure seems to resemble field teams, as if each person was in charge of a dimension of human development. This makes some contemporary thinkers suggest that perhaps the book is describing an encounter with beings from a higher plane, not as metaphors, but as an experience that Enoch tried to faithfully record with the words he had at his disposal. But the most shocking thing is realizing that all of this happened without authorization. These teachings, according to the text itself, should not have been delivered. They accelerated humanity beyond its natural pace. and this acceleration brought deep imbalances. If the Watchers offered spiritual and material technologies that altered human destiny, what exactly triggered the collapse that led to the flood? And why did higher forces feel they needed to intervene to reset humanity? When the Uzai Book of Enoch enters the narrative of the fall of the Watchers, something profoundly changes in the atmosphere of the text. We are no longer just faced with beings who taught elevated knowledge. Now we enter the territory of consequences. And it is here that the book begins to weave a spiritual, and perhaps interdimensional, explanation for one of the most remarkable events of antiquity, the flood. The story, which appears in so many cultures around the world, takes on a different shape in Enoch. It is not just divine punishment. It is an attempt to restore a balance that had been disrupted. According to the text, the Watchers crossed borders that should not have been crossed. They didn't just teach. They interfered emotionally, physically, genetically. The birth of the Nephilim, the giants, symbolizes this mixing between dimensions that generated a lineage outside of its original purpose. To many modern scholars, this description seems more like an energetic breakdown than a simple moral error. It is as if two frequencies, when mixed, created an unstable vibration that threatened the entire human field. A forced fusion between the dense and the subtle that simply could not be sustained over time. The narrative intensifies when Enoch describes how these hybrid beings began to consume everything around them, depleting resources and bringing chaos to humanity. This image is not just literal. It can be seen as a symbol of what happens when superior forces project themselves onto the material plane without care, excess, imbalance, the disruption of the structures that sustain life. The chaos of the Nephilim represents the collapse of a humanity accelerated beyond its spiritual maturity, almost as if we were facing a civilization that received too much knowledge in too little time. The text states that the Watchers were tried and imprisoned, as if they were isolated in another layer of reality. Some researchers interpret this as a vibrational ceiling, where interdimensional beings are prevented from accessing planes that no longer match their frequency. Others see this as a metaphor for the rebalancing of the forces of the human psyche. After all, Enoch may also be narrating spiritual truths, encoded in symbols that speak both to the sky and to the interior of the soul. But the most striking point in this part of the book is the moment when superior forces decide to intervene. The text describes a celestial meeting, a council that observes what humanity has become after the Watchers' interference. It is not a punishment for disobedience. It is an attempt to preserve human existence itself. The flood, in this view, is not destruction, it is reset, a spiritual and physical reset to allow humanity to return to its axis, away from knowledge that burned like fire before its time. This idea resonates with diverse spiritual and scientific traditions. Depth psychology speaks of cycles of collapse and rebirth. Quantum physics admits that unstable systems inevitably encounter a breaking point. Ancient cultures narrate cyclical renewals of the earth. In Enoch, all of this converges in a single gesture, restarting to protect. And this is where the book brings one of the most poetic and profound images. Enoch intercedes for humanity, and his voice is heard. He is not just a writer, he is a mediator between planes, someone who walks between worlds. Your compassion becomes a bridge. Its presence symbolizes that even when celestial forces move, the human is not forgotten. There is always someone listening, advising, guiding. If the flood was a reset, what exactly did Enoch see in the heavens before he was taken away? And why was he, of all people, chosen to witness the hidden side of creation? When we reach the part where Enoch is taken to the heavens, the book abandons any sense of simplicity and dives into an experience that many today would interpret as an interdimensional journey. He doesn't just describe angels talking to him, describes portals, lights, vibrations, displacements, celestial structures that open as if they were living gears. It is as if Enoch was trying to translate into human language something so vast and so complex that the words seemed too small compared to what his senses were absorbing there in front of him. The text states that he was led by luminous beings to the ends of the earth, where he saw gates of wind, pillars of light, celestial chambers, and forces that move the cosmos. It is not a static vision. It is a dynamic, pulsating environment, as if it were within a greater consciousness. This description is surprisingly reminiscent of modern accounts of human experience, those of near-death and altered states of consciousness. People who have experienced NDEs speak of intense light, beings of indescribable brilliance, telepathic communication, the absence of time, and a feeling of multidimensional displacement. Enoch describes all of this, centuries in advance, as if he were opening the curtains on a reality that surpasses any traditional religious system beyond it. In several passages, Enoch states that he was taken from sphere to sphere, guided by entities that taught him about the movement of the stars, the function of angels, the organization of the heavens. It is almost impossible not to notice the similarity of this to the modern concept of dimensional layers, as if each level were a different vibrational state. He speaks of places where time did not flow, where living forms were made of sounds, where light had density. All of this dialogues with contemporary lines of quantum physics, which recognize that reality can have multiple dimensions, some inaccessible to our senses, but completely real in the fabric of the universe. The most impressive thing is that Enoch describes these trips as if he were actually there. There is no vague metaphor. There is movement, change, fright, fascination. He speaks of houses that moved, walls made of living fire, beings that expanded when they spoke, and spaces that could not be measured. The feeling is that he crossed dimensions like a traveler trying to record a lucid dream, knowing that his language will never be enough to fully convey what he experienced on that other plane so vast beyond. But the most moving part is when Enoch realizes that he wasn't just taken to learn, he was taken to remember. The text suggests that the human soul has a higher origin than we imagine, as if someone was saying to Enoch, "This is where you came from. This is what you have forgotten." This revelation touches the reader deeply, because it ignites within us the ancestral memory that we belong to something bigger, more luminous, more vast than we can imagine when trapped within the limits of everyday life. And it is at this point that the most intense moment of reflection arises. Enoch sees the balance between worlds. He understands that the fall of the Watchers was not just an external event, but an imbalance between layers of being, that when one dimension interferes with another inappropriately, everything that is subtle becomes disorganized. Your journey to the heavens is not just contemplation, it's restoration. It is as if he is exposed to the original map of creation to understand why humanity needed a new beginning. And here comes the inner invitation. If something within you is awakening, stay with me until the end. There's an answer quietly building in every layer of this story, and perhaps it's about to emerge in the next step, because the question is now inevitable. What did Enoch see on the last level of this heavenly path, and how might this vision transform the way we understand our own origins? There is a point in Enoch's journey where the narrative stops being just description and becomes revelation. When he reaches the last level of his ascension, the text changes temperature. The light gains thickness. Silence gains a voice. Enoch is no longer just a visitor, is witness to something that seems to exist before time itself. He looks at what the book calls the abode of glory, but which today many could interpret as the luminous center of all dimensions, a vibrational core where consciousness, energy, and creation meet in a single continuous pulsation that reveals itself. At that moment, there are no more angels guiding your steps. There are no detailed explanations. There is just a presence that surrounds him, as if the entire universe breathes at the same rhythm as him. It is a vision that goes beyond the religious and enters the territory of the unnameable. Enoch describes forces that sustain the cosmos, gears of light that turn without rest, rivers of energy that flow in and out of realities. He doesn't say, "I understand," he says, "I saw," as if the great truth were not a concept, but a state, not something to be explained, but something to be remembered. And then comes the gesture that defines his entire journey. He doesn't ask for answers for himself. He intercedes for humanity. He remembers us, and that's what makes his story so deeply human. Even in the face of infinite vastness, he turns his heart to those who remained on earth, fragile, confused, learning to walk between light and shadow. It's as if saying that, even when we touch higher dimensions, our mission is never to abandon the world, but to understand it with more compassion. When Enoch returns, he does not return as someone who brings formulas or dogmas. He returns as a bridge, He returns as someone who saw what we are before we were. He understood that our story does not begin in clay, but in light, that our origin is not trapped in matter, but in consciousness that dwells beyond it. And perhaps that is the true purpose of the Book of Enoch, to remind the human soul of what it has always known. It doesn't matter whether we see it as a sacred text, a spiritual metaphor, or an account of interdimensional contact. What matters is what he awakens, because there are books that inform, and there are books that open doors within us. And now, as we reach the end of this path, there is one last question hanging in the air, a question that does not require haste or an immediate answer, just presence. What if what we call heaven isn't a place above us, but a state within which we are still learning to awaken? If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may just be beginning to remember the path.